on this computer. Go right ahead, Hirsch.
Okay, so, well, this is the final lesson out of my series, and I'm glad to see that there are still people showing up. Um, it was one of the things I was a little worried about, but it seems to be working. So, okay, so this is part 6 out of 6. And just some of the basic stuff. This is part 6 of 6. These classes are aimed at SCA heraldry, although I think everybody that has been showing up is SCA, so that's kind of a moot point. But I thought there was always the possibility we might get some people from outside of the SCA showing up. Now, I'm going to try to be thorough. I can't present everything. If you've been on other lessons, you've heard this before. But the idea is that heraldry is a huge topic, and you can't possibly, even in a set of 6 lessons, you can't possibly cover everything that can ever be done with heraldry. So there's always going to be more information. There's always going to be more stuff, some rules, some something, whatever it happens to be. So don't worry about it. I don't expect you to memorize any of this. The stuff that tends to stick in your head is the stuff that you use the most, and that's just life in general. So there we are. Okay, the basic rules, mics are off. Sarah will be keeping an eye on chat, although she needs to leave for a while later. But I'll try to keep an eye on stuff. Let me see if I move the mouse. Nope, the mouse isn't doing anything up there. Must be over here. Nope, I'm not seeing it. Okay. Well, if a question comes up and I don't catch you, write it down and we'll deal with it at the end of the class. And questions are important though, and that's one of the things I always, when I teach, I always try to enforce the idea that questions are vital to understanding what's going on. So if I talk about something and it doesn't make sense, don't assume you're the only person who's not understanding it. It's very likely there's somebody else who doesn't understand it as well. And asking questions is a very good thing for everybody. So, okay. So what are we going to talk about? So we're going to try to wrap everything up, but it's going to be a fairly lengthy session because there's a lot of stuff that we haven't talked about yet. So this is going to be talking about pulling things together, creating armory, trying to follow the basic rules. We're not going to get into all the details of all the rules because that's a whole other session. That's a whole or two. But we're going to talk about a few rules that everybody kind of needs to know about. Hopefully, if you've been in on other lessons, they started your creative juices. Otherwise, maybe you've already been thinking about things that you might want to do. We will be talking about the philosophy behind medieval heraldry versus modern art because that's an important concept, and we're going to look at it from a few different places. I will include a few design techniques we haven't discussed yet because they just didn't come up in the individual topics we were looking at. We spent a lot of time looking at charges, and now we're going to be putting things together. And so there's a lot that you can do that I haven't had a chance to talk about. And of course, there's more terminology. And if you're going to register something in the SCA, there are a few rules. And so there are things that we really do need to talk about, but I'm not going to get into conflict research and things like that. It's just too big a topic. So this lesson is probably going to be as long as the last one, which was just around 2 hours. It may be a touch longer. It may be a little bit shorter. It depends on the usual stuff. So, okay. So the first thing I want to bring up is the concept of my family coat of arms. And I'm bringing this up because quite often it comes up at a consultation table or something where somebody says, my family has a coat of arms and I would like to use it. And so we need to talk about that. So the concept is really kind of invalid. It was created by Ma and Pa heraldry shops, and I call them that because they showed up in the weirdest places. For a while when you went to Disneyland and you were in Fantasyland, there was actually a heraldry shop. And what they did was they would look up your modern name and they would find one of the coats of arms that might possibly be associated with your modern name and give you some piece, and you would pay for some piece of artwork that they would do with that coat of arms. And American Express did that and all kinds of stuff. So the important thing here is that a coat of arms belongs to an individual, both in the real world and in the SCA. In the real world, the odds are very good that that coat of arms was inherited through the family, usually through the first son. But however they were inherited, they still belong to that individual. So even if you have a family coat of arms or a coat of arms that is registered to someone in your family, the odds are that they're not yours. Another aspect of this that I didn't put on the slide simply because there's only so much room is that I'm actually a really good example of this. The Ma and Pa heraldry shops tend to use British heraldry books. My family is German. My family name is German, except that when they moved to America, the spelling of the last name was changed at Ellis Island. Okay, so the odds are the spelling for my last modern name is very different from anything that they would look up in Papworths or any of the standard resources that are used. So they wouldn't have found my if my German family had a coat of arms, they wouldn't have found them in Papworths because that's British armory. So anyway, if you want to reference what you believe is a family coat of arms, you can select elements, colors, charges off of the coat of arms, whatever, and use them in your own device or coat of arms. But you probably shouldn't try to use the full coat of arms. And that's because they belong to somebody outside the SCA. And you should remember that the whole point of the SCA is that we're creating a persona of someone who might have existed in the period we're recreating. We're not trying to create or reenact people who actually existed, which is why you can't call yourself Henry Plantagenet and so on. So anyway, so I wanted to get that one out of the way. Okay, now when we are designing heraldry, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be considered. And so Eowyn's article, which I referenced throughout all of these lessons, and I've got links to it and so on in the notes, talks about heraldic style. And it talks about it's typified by these qualities. Clarity, a strong design, usually a simple design. Contrast, light colors against dark colors. Again, that falls into the rule of tincture, so it's pretty kind of important. Balance. So your designs tend to be symmetrical. Asymmetry is not really all that common in period heraldry. Repetition. So what this means is if you have multiple objects, they tend to be the same kind. If you've got 3 objects on a device and one of them is a sword and one of them is an arrow and one of them is a heart, that gets into all kinds of issues that just don't really work for medieval design. Okay. And they fill the space. And one of the tricky ones, we actually had somebody recently submit something to the college here in the West where it might have actually been legal. It might have been something we could register, except that the charges were very small for the amount of space that they were in. They weren't filling the space, and they were actually touching the edge of the shield, which they normally wouldn't do because they were animals, and they wouldn't normally be touching the side of the shield, and so on. And so we ended up having to send it back for a redraw, and they ended up doing something completely different from what we suggested, which is okay. But anyway. But the fact that it needs to fill the space, it needs to actually, you've got this open space there, and the idea is that your charges should be filling that space. So one of the biggest issues that comes up is heraldry versus modern art. The modern mindset, our mindset, isn't always what the medieval mindset is. If you've looked at a lot of tapestries or scrolls or artwork from the period or books of hours and all of that, you get a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. So I wanted to bring up this one article because this came up when I was working with someone on a rather large project a while back, and the guy had done a few pieces of art for me, and he came back and he complained that heraldry is so flat. It's because he's used to working in 3-dimensional artwork and so on. And so this is what we're going to talk about first here on the modern art thing. For the purpose of the class, I'm going to open Hillary's article, which is on the philosophical roots of heraldic design. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but I did want to bring it up because she does a couple of really useful things here. The first one is the bit with the lions here. And what I wanted to show you is the first one is a modern sensibility. It's a lion that's about to leap off the shield. And in the Middle Ages, basically the Middle Ages, the medieval times, the Renaissance times, and so on. This isn't how people thought. A person had their place, things were stable, things stayed the way that they were, they didn't change all the time, and so on. And so what you end up with instead is the second lion over here, which is actually a lion salient. And this guy isn't moving. He's not going anywhere. He's balanced, and so on. He could stand in that position forever. And that's kind of the idea of the way medieval mindset works with art. Okay, so when we come down here, the other one is people like to do, and this would actually fall into what we call, and I'm going to talk about this later, pictorial heraldry or landscape heraldry, where you're trying to show something that's almost like a snapshot, where you've got, in this case, an eagle flying above a sun but below a cloud, things like that. And the symmetry is just weird, okay? First off, this would fall into a category called slot machine heraldry, and again, we'll talk about that more in a later point. And Hillary ends up working this through a process of taking it from here to the second picture to the third picture right here, which kind of incorporates all the concepts. So you have an eagle, you have a sun, and then because they're doing a chief, an arched, engrailed, no, I'm sorry, invected, or maybe it's engrailed. No, it'd be invected, sorry. Anyway, those two always get confused. Anyway, so you get the feel of the cloud with the chief up on the top, and then you put the eagle on top of the sun, and it's a little more period in feel. Okay, it's not really the best version of that, but it was something that just kind of gives you a better feeling for what can be done. And then she comes down and she does some more with visual weight and so on. This is a really useful article for people, and it's in the Herald's Handbook, and the link is in the notes for the slides and all of that. So the one that is also very important down here is showing multiple charges on the field. In this case, it's multiple lions. So we have asymmetrical, which is the first one. We have a marginal symmetry. So we basically have this lion up in the corner up here. We actually have something in the way of symmetry here. We have two lions in bend, okay? And then basically it says per bend, but they're actually in bend. And then we have here radial symmetry, which is an interesting way of doing things. And finally, this was actually, if you had three lions, this is actually the most common way of doing it, 2 and 1. And notice that the one in the bottom is larger than the ones in top. That's because you're filling the field. So you're taking this empty space and filling it with the charges. Okay, so those are the interesting things that I wanted to put in there. I know that that's kind of a lot to think about, but it's not that bad if you look at a lot of heraldry. And if you ever have questions about that kind of thing, always talk to somebody. We're always willing to talk to people about all of this. So, okay, so that's the first bit on the modern art stuff. Now, the next thing we want to talk about, some more modern art stuff, is the three-dimensional versus flat. And that's, like I state, that's kind of an important aspect. And we see people these days will take for digital art versions of Armory, and they will create kind of a three-dimensional feel to the shield, so it kind of has this weird, shape to it. That's not really how our ancestors thought, but it's a minor artistic license thing, so I'm not going to worry about it. But we will also talk about layers in a bit here. But the term for three-dimensional objects is in trian aspect, which is in three-dimensional aspect. There are very few charges that are allowed to be done that way. We saw in the last lesson a die, because the only way you can tell that it's a die is by making it three-dimensional. Otherwise, it's a square, and I'm losing the term. I've lost the term already. But anyway, a delf, which is a square with a dot on it. And that doesn't really look like a die. One of the other ones is a cheesecake. Apparently, a slice of cheesecake is acceptable because it has an in trian aspect. Because again, otherwise it looks like a triangle. So anyway, there's a breakdown on some of this in the rules if you really want to look at it. I didn't want to get into a lot of detail on this particular aspect, but there are a small amount of items that are allowed in trian aspect, and the rest tend to be flat. So now, excessively pictorial. I mentioned that with the article in Hillary. Designs cannot be what is called excessively pictorial. And this is actually the actual wording in the rules. Um, and I have a link to that ruling, which also gives a couple of examples and so on. But if it looks too much like a picture, like you've taken a camera out and made a picture, or made your arms based off of a photograph that you took. So the simple example is something that's meant to represent a grassy field with an animal under a tree and blue sky. That is landscape heraldry. Okay, and that's actually a term that we sometimes use is landscape heraldry. Are excessively are naturalistic, and what we mean here, and this is a fairly wordy way of basically stating, a lot of animals in period, most of the animals in period have very specific positions and postures, and some of them may not look all that naturalistic, but those are the ones that we use for designing heraldry. Um, and the problem is that again, the modern mindset, you may want to make it look more naturalistic, and that's not what was done in heraldry. Okay, that's not what was done in period. Um, if you draw a creature in a style that's incredibly naturalistic, it's no longer heraldic. Um, so now I did give an example, and it's in the notes that talks about that we used to use a posture for a domestic cat called Hericity, which was a cat with its back arched, staring at you from that position, um, and it's hissing, obviously, and the fur is all standing on end and all of that, which is something that anybody who owns a cat has probably seen at least once. But anyway, but we don't do that one anymore because again, it's very modern. Okay, so during the lessons, you will have seen me, if you have been there for the other lessons, you'll see me talk or heard me talk about what is called the step from core practice. This is an important concept, and I'm using it in this part of the lesson because it kind of relates to the modern art thing. But the basic definition here refers to the idea that while certain armorial elements were not used in period core style, they are close enough to period elements to be allowed for use. Okay, so what this really comes down to, though, is the way the rules work is that you can have one. You can have one item on your device or on your armory that falls into the SFCP category, but if you have two or more, then it's grounds for return. Okay, so the college will state, nope, you can't do that. So that would include all kinds of stuff. And again, there's an example, there's a list of some of what's available in the rules or what this talk is talking about. As we were looking at things, paw prints, very common in SCA heraldry. Those fall into the step from core practice. They weren't used in heraldry in period. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that one up. If you've been around with the heralds for a while, this one used to be called a step from period practice, and we also used to call it a weirdness. So you couldn't have two weirdnesses on a coat of arms. Okay. So now I mentioned before the concept of slot machine heraldry. Slot machine heraldry is literally what it sounds like. Okay, three unrelated charges in this case that have basically a valid similar weight to each other, and what you end up with is something that is just not done in period at all. Okay, three or more charges like this just don't really work. Now, I do note in here people have special reasons for a lot of things, and I'm not trying to suggest that we're regulating or invalidating those reasons. You may want to be trying to represent each of your children with a different charge, or it may be some other thing. Maybe it's jobs that you've had in the past and you're trying to represent your life on your coat of arms, or, okay, fine, but there are ways to do it that are a little more period. Okay. So the first example up here on the right shows a really standard classic slot machine heraldry. Three charges that have approximately equal weight or size, and they have nothing to do with each other. Okay. So the second one assumes that maybe somebody talked the person out of having all three of those charges. Maybe the roundel wasn't as important as the crescents and the heart, things like that. And of course, for a herald, even better would be three crescents. Okay. So, but anyway, So there are lots of ways to achieve this kind of thing. There are lots of ways to use multiple charges if you really need to, for just to make yourself happy, to have come up with a coat of arms that really works for you. If you aren't feeling it, or you just aren't sure how to get there, work with a herald. That's what we're here for. Okay. You would be surprised. We've got people who are really creative and can help you get to what you really want to do, and hopefully end up with something that you like. Well, that's kind of the goal, right? So, okay. So I talked about fieldless a bit in previous slides. Fieldless is just what it sounds like. There's no field. And the point of a fieldless badge is that a lot of badges in period, especially household badges and so on, were meant to be used as jewelry. And so, for example, the Tudor rose was often used as a piece of jewelry, and it wasn't displayed on a field or on a banner per se. Or if it was displayed on a banner, the banner could be any color as long as it had the Tudor rose on it, and everybody knew that what your affiliation was. Okay, so fieldless is only used for badges. A device has to have a field, and most badges tend to have fields as well. But the biggest part of having a fieldless badge is that it must have either a single charge or charges that are conjoined in some fashion, meaning they're touching each other, effectively creating a single charge. Okay? So, and the idea again is that these could be used as a piece of jewelry or anything like that. Without any background, they can be displayed on any background. And that means that, for example, if you have a household and you wanted to have a specific charge that represented your household, you could create that charge on a fieldless badge, and then the members of your household could display it on whatever color banner that they're using, and it wouldn't make any difference. It would be perfectly acceptable. Okay. Now, I'm giving you an example here. I was looking for something that can join charges to give you a nice fieldless thing. And this is a couple of people registered in CAI. This may be something they're doing as a household badge. I'm not real sure. But anyway, so the idea is you have a crescent and a crescent pendant. They're conjoined in pale, which means vertically. So they're actually touching each other, although you can't really tell because on top of them, you have a lozenge ployé, which is the curved sides to the lozenge. So, but the idea is that all of this effectively becomes a single charge. And so for the purpose of a fieldless badge, this is absolutely what we're looking at. And this is the kind of thing that was done in period for a lot of households and things like that, is that you basically bring it down to a single charge by combining the charges that you might want to use. It's kind of an interesting way to do that. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, there's some other notes that if you look at the notes, there's some other details, but we don't need to go into that. So, okay, so the other one that's important here is layers. And we talked briefly about it in an early lesson, but I always want to talk about layers when we're looking at actually building a coat of arms, okay, or building a badge or building whatever piece of armory that you're doing. So the field itself can be a single color, it can be a combination, it can be a field that's divided in parts, but it's always the field. It's always the background of the device. This can include field treatments, it can include furs, and all of that good stuff. It does not include semes, which we talked about, which is a group of charges placed on the field. Those are what are called as secondary charges, or they're the second layer on the device. Okay. Layer 2 is a charge or charges placed on the field. So this can be the ordinaries, it can be beasts, it can be two swords, it can be whatever you're placing on the field itself. When we talk about a charge, I'm not going to spend any real time on charge groups. I reference it. Charge groups get really complicated, and for the most part, you don't need to worry about them too much. And again, a herald will hopefully walk you through if you're running into an issue there. Layer 3 is a charge or charges placed on another charge. So this gets interesting as well. So these can be secondary or tertiary charges depending on how the device is laid out. And you cannot have a fourth layer. So basically, a charge or charges placed on anything considered to be layer 3 is not allowed. It's called quaternary charges. They're not allowed in SCA heraldry, and they really weren't used in period heraldry. Okay. There are some special cases. A charge that is called overall is partly on the field and partly across some charge or charge group. If you have a sum of charges on the field, then placing a lion on top of that would be an overall charge. If you had a bend across the field and you placed the lion on top of that, but it's partly on the field and it's partly on the bend, then that would also be what is called overall. Okay. Sustained or maintained charges. We'll look at this again in a later slide. I have some nice examples of this, but the difference here is the size of the charge that's being held. So if you have a bear holding a great sword, that might actually be sustained versus a maintained charge, which is a smaller charge. It's a little tricky and a little weird. And, to leave it to the College of Arms to make things a little more complicated, but that's how it goes sometimes, trying to accommodate all kinds of different things. So I do have some nice little stuff here on layers as well. So I wanted to talk about this. I had my friendly artist in Golden Rivers help me out here. So a simple device, really simple. This is literally an argent field with a bend that is gules and 3 roundels on top of the bend. Okay, but I figured it might be useful to look at this in 3 dimensions. So I had Rav work with me on this, and he created this image. And in order to help, the field is argent, the bend is gules, that's the red part, and the third layer is the roundels on top of it. So you get the 3 different layers that are possible. The important part here is that's as far as you can go. You cannot put anything on top of the roundels here. Now, if the roundels were on the field, you could put something on top of the roundels. But because they're on top of the bend, you can't. Putting them on the field will put them at level 2. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But the big thing here is that you cannot go any further than this. You cannot add the 4th layer. Okay, okay. So let's see, a few more things. Fimbriation and voiding. This is something we haven't really talked about. So I put in the definition out of the College of Arms, which is literally voiding and fimbriation are terms that describe the situation in which the interior of the charge is different color from the strip around it. Okay, the term voiding is used for the case in which the interior part is the same color as the field. Fimbriation is used to outline something. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples. So these are SCA examples except for one. So the first one gives you the arms of Wilhelm von Homburg, who used to be a herald here in the West. He had life and dropped out, but that's how things go. Anyway, he has a bend or fimbriated gules. Okay, notice the word gules ends up at the end. That's because the border and the fimbriation are both the same color. But the basic thing here is that in order to get the gold bend or the yellow bend on top of the white field, it's fimbriated. And this allows him to do that. That's the only way you can get away with doing something along those lines. Okay. Now, it is important to note if the bend is wavy, the fimbriation would also be wavy. So it's important because the fimbriation follows the outline of the charge. Okay. So I put an example here of codicing because codicing and fimbriation can look very similar to each other, and people sometimes get confused. So I had Rav put together just a real simple example of a bend gules codice, or bend codice gules, okay, which basically everything is the same color. So codices are interesting because what you see is that the codices don't touch the bend. Okay, there's a space between them, and you see the field that's underneath everything between the 2 charges. Okay, and even more fun, the codices could be a different color. So you could have a bend codice sable, a bend gules codice sable. If you wanted the codices, which would be the 2 lines, would be black instead. The bend itself could be wavy, and the codices could be straight. The codices could also be wavy, or you could go the other direction. The bend could be straight lined, and the codices could be wavy. So this gives you a huge amount of possibility for just making things a little more interesting for your arms, okay? And so I wanted to give you that. I know I showed you a bunch of examples when we were looking at ordinaries in the 2nd lesson, but I didn't actually talk about them in that aspect, okay? So I wanted to make sure I covered that. I'm also giving you another example of fimbriation. This is the arms of Andrew O'Riga. And way back in the before time, when the college was first learning about a lot of stuff, it was possible to take creatures and fimbriate them. This is how he gets a blue wyvern on top of a black field. However, you can no longer do this. A wyvern is not a simple geometric charge. Okay, and that's an important aspect, is that fimbriation and codicing, but fimbriation right here, which is what we're really talking about, can only be done on simple geometric charges. That includes most of the ordinaries. It includes most of the subordinaries, but not necessarily all of them, but most of them. And it allows you that capability to put something that normally you couldn't legally do. So like I say, with the bend for the first image here, normally you could not put a gold bend on a white field, but because it's fimbriated, you can get away with it. Okay. So, and then I give you voided, and this is from an SCA coat of arms, a triangle voided between three crescents. So the idea is that the triangle is showing you the background of the device or the field, because it's voided. The inside of it is missing. So it's like somebody just cut the inside out. If this individual wanted to have the inside of the triangle to be red, they could do that. It would be a triangle vert voided gules. So it's possible to do things like that as well. Okay, so I'm trying to give you some possibilities for things that might be useful. Again, voiding can only be done on simple geometric charges. Okay, and again, you can do that with the bend, or you can do it with all kinds of other charges, but they all have to be the simple ones. Okay, so that's one of the most important parts of that. So anyway, so there's that. So marshalling. Now here we get into an interesting concept. Marshalling came about as Europe kept going and kept growing, and the College of Arms, people wanted to show relationships. And what you end up with is some very complex heraldry. And so I want to show you the basic concepts of marshalling. And I decided to quote Heather Child from her book because she did a really good explanation of the three basic forms of marshalling. Okay, so the first thing is it's the combination of two or more coats of arms on one shield to indicate the alliance of families. Okay, so now there are three basic ways of doing this. The first one is called impalement, and the image that she gives here is actually are some really simple arms. Okay, if there was something on either side of the bend for the left half here, you would have to try to work that in here, because the idea is this is the whole coat of arms on the left and the whole coat of arms on the right, and they're basically just combined down the middle. Okay, now that's a little tricky to do, and so one of the other forms is called dimidiation, where you're basically cutting the two arms in half down the middle, and then you're combining them together. And the two examples she chose actually has charges that match up. They wouldn't necessarily match up. It would depend on what were on the arms. The person on the right for one of these might actually just have a red field on the right side, and that would be all that would show up here, rather than the fishtails, for example. But that's how you would do dimidiation. Okay, quartering is something that, again, the modern mindset goes, oh, that's a cool idea. I could put different things on the different quarters. Well, again, that falls into the marshalling issue. Okay, the appearance of marshalling is something we don't do in SCA heraldry. Okay, so you have to avoid the appearance of marshalling, even if that's not what you intended to do. So marshalling is the combination of two or more arms into a single design. By doing so, you're making a claim about the person we do not allow in registered arms. Okay, I'll come back to that concept in a moment. Okay, so just a little bit more on marshalling. Child doesn't talk about a couple of things that the SCA actually does kind of deal with. Charges that end at the edge of a section. So if you basically have broken the arms into multiple parts, and you have a charge that ends at the side, at the line of division or something, is looking like you're trying to marshal a different set of arms into something. Sections that are subdivided. And this one I drew up simply because just trying to read this blazon, per pale gules and quarterly argent and azure, I was having a hard time envisioning it myself, and I've been doing heraldry for a long time. So I figured I would draw it up and give you an idea of what they're talking about. If you were to try to do something like this, again, you're getting the appearance of marshalling, because it looks like the part on the right half of the device is a completely different set of arms, and so it looks like you're combining two different sets of arms. Okay, so multiple types of primary charges. So again, if you had like a quarterly field and you had a charge that was different on each of the four quarters, that looks like you're trying to do martial arms again. You're trying to do relationships and so on. There's also the possibility of, and we talked about this when we looked at cantons, you can't place charges on them unless you have an augmentation of arms. And a scutcheon shape, the same thing. And a lozenge on a fieldless badge. Okay. Now, if your fieldless badge has a lozenge, and again you have an augmentation, that's a different story. But if the lozenge is on a device or a badge that has a field, apparently it's perfectly fine to put charges on it. It's because it's a fieldless badge. And this actually goes back to the early days of the SCA, but also going back to a lot of our books. Fox Davies mentions this and so on, is that um, it was assumed in a later period than what the SCA actually does in the Elizabethan era and so on, that a woman would display her arms on a lozenge. And so when the SCA College of Arms started up, you had a heater shape for men to register their arms and a lozenge shape for women to register their arms, until the women said, what I want to do doesn't work on a lozenge. I want to have a heater shape. And so the College of Arms relented and backed off of that. But that used to be an issue. And so that could actually look like you're trying to do on a fieldless badge. You're trying to make a claim to somebody else's arms. So that's where that comes from. So there's more details. And again, I have some more details in the notes for this slide if you feel like trying to read them. There is a bit in here. One of the things that I found interesting is it talks about quarterly being a problem with marshaled arms, but there's some recent rule changes that allow an augmentation to have in the first and fourth quarters, which would be the upper left and the bottom right corners of the device, your own arms, and then the augmentation in the other two quarters, which normally would be marshaled arms, except that's also a period form of doing an augmentation of arms. So there's some really odd, ways that the rules can be twisted a little bit, or are twisted a little bit. So there you go. Now, a little bit more. I wanted to give you a couple of examples of why marshalling is a bad idea. Over time, what you end up with is this. If you have a couple that marries, and then one of their offspring marries somebody else, and they do a merge of those arms, you end up with more and more complicated as their child grows up and gets married. The arms get to be a mess. And if you're looking at that from across a field, you ruin the whole concept of heraldry in the first place, which is identifiability. If you have to stand there and look at the arms and try to figure out that's the son, no, the grandson of, and so on. It's just ugly, and the one on the right's even worse. So anyway, I do want to point out, however, you cannot register marshaled arms, but if you want to create a banner that shows the marriage of two people, you can create a banner that does domitiated or whatever, and you can do that and display it at events. We can't regulate what banners you make and display. The College of Heralds cannot regulate any of that. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Okay. Now we can regulate what you can register, but we can't regulate what you decide to display. So, okay, so we've talked about charges and tinctures in general over all the different lessons before. Okay, charges can be placed on the field, they can be placed on other charges, but they must follow the rule of tincture. So again, you're looking at contrast. You can't place a gold charge on top of a white charge or a white field, all of that stuff. And we talked about this relentlessly, but it's an important rule. Charges may also use the lines of partition. We saw a few, mostly some of the beasties we saw There was a lion that I showed you in one lesson, and there was a bird that I showed you in another lesson that used the lines of partition. And this allows you to do some interesting things with the creatures for the coloration and so on. You can also use the varied fields like berry, bendy, checky, and all of that. So again, you can do some fun little things here that I haven't really shown you a lot of options, but there are options available for what you can do here. So, wow, that's weird. Oh, there's a toolbar that's only showing up. Wow, that's okay. Weird. Okay. So anyway, charges may also use furs. They can use field treatments. They can use semeys. You can make a lion semay of semi-de-lis, which is before fleur-de-lis, all kinds of stuff. So you can do a lot with this that, again, we've only briefly touched on if we really talked about it all. So I wanted to make sure I covered all of that. And we will talk about proper in the next slide just one more time. Okay. So proper is a nice way for heralds to be able to not have to define all the colors for some things. And it gets a little more complicated with some animals and so on. But proper is used as colored in nature. And so a tree proper has a brown tree trunk and green leaves, and all of that. Okay. Bears come in different colors, but if no color is given in a blazon, the bear is by default is brown, or if it is used proper. Okay, so if you call a bear proper, it's going to be brown. Okay, unless you call it specifically a polar bear proper, in which case it's going to be white. So a charge defined as proper must follow the rules of tincture. One of the important places are with fire, where fire is alternating red and yellow flames. So the outside flames are what are going to be defined by what you're placing it on top of. If you have a white field, then the outside flames would be red and the inside flames would alternate red and gold, red and yellow. But if you were placing it on a black field, then the outside flames would be yellow, and then the inside flames would be alternating red and yellow as well. So anyway, things like that. So again, you're dealing with the rule of tincture. You always have to keep that rule in mind. So when we were talking about a variety of charges, as I went, I tried to give some of the proper definitions, so they'll be in the notes for a lot of the lessons. But I also provide a link in the glossary for the College of Arms that gives the current interpretation for the various forms of proper. And that includes inanimate charges like swords. So a sword proper is hilted gold and the blade is silver, okay, or argent. Okay. So anyway, so here's a fun one. I always love this one because this is a really cool thing to do. And I like the fact that Fryer defines it as one of the most attractive and most popular conventions in armory. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples here. The first one is the Arms of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And this is actually literally black and white. That's the actual colors that are in the book, but they're also the actual colors that are registered to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. But what's happening here is that you've got a per pale line of division with a chevron on top of it. And so what happens is the per pale line goes through the chevron and you alternate the colors of the field with the color of the charge. And so rather than calling it something complicated, you can simply call it counterchanged. And that automatically gives you this. Now, another way to do that is to put charges on either side of a line of division. And this is my own personal arms. Because it was there. But it's two stag's heads erased, respect, and counterchanged. And so the idea is that you counter color across the line. That makes it really cool, and it really stands out. It really kind of grabs the eye. Now, the last example is one I just kind of made up for the purpose of showing you, multiple charges where one of them is crossing the line, but the others aren't. But again, the idea is that you're just crossing the colors, as where the line crosses the roundel at the bottom. You're just reversing the colors, and the ones above you're reversing the colors with the field as well. And you don't have to put a lot of effort into defining it. And again, it really is eye-catching. Okay, so these examples that I've given you are all using per pale because that was just the easy version. You can use pretty much any line of division, and you can use the standard. You can use a standard partition, so per bin, per chevron, per saltier, etc. And you can also use the complex lines of division, so you could add wavy or whatever to that on top of it. So this gives you a lot of cool stuff that you can do just by some simple changes to what's going on. Okay, and being able to just counter change like that is, again, it is striking. I mean, it really kind of grabs the eye, and I'm really partial to it. So okay, so when you're looking at all of the creatures, and again, we talked about the creatures, monsters, humans, whatever, they have postures. Okay, and inanimate objects have, a lot of them have default orientations. When we were looking at weapons, arrows are arrowhead down, where swords are point of the sword up. Those are default orientations for those particular charges. And again, you don't have to specify those if that's what you're using. So if you decided to use a lion, and you did not define the posture, it would be rampant by default. Okay. If you said a lion to sinister without stating rampant, it would be a lion rampant facing to sinister rather than to dexter. Okay. So this kind of it kind of saves a few words in the blazon. Although these days the College of Arms tends to be a little more wordy in the blazon, just because it makes sure that there's no confusion. Okay. And I mention that because it's very easy for someone reading a blazon to accidentally misunderstand something in the wording. So if the heralds are very clear, if a term is left out, some people don't understand that there's a specific term that's just not being shown because it's a default term. And so if the word is left out, then some people might just do something completely different than what was intended. And so the College of Arms tends to be more specific, so sometimes the blazons have more words in them than might not necessarily need to be there. Okay, so many inanimate objects have a default posture. An arrow is palewise head to base, and so on. You can define that as different. You can call the arrow inverted, which would put the head to chief. If the arrow is fess-wise, it would be horizontal, and then you have to determine which direction the arrowhead is on. Okay, so if the head is to dexter, that would be, you would have to define that in the blazon. So, and there's a whole listing in the glossary for the College of Arms, and so I put a link in because, again, you're not expected to memorize this stuff. And again, so don't try. I'm always looking it up. Okay. Now, charges on ordinaries. I did want to give you some examples of what I mean by placing charges on ordinaries here, because this gets a little crazy. Oops, I just did something weird here. Oh, there we are. Okay. On a bend or a bend sinister, charges default to the orientation of the ordinary. So what this means is an arrow, which normally defaults to being per pale, would default to per bend, and you wouldn't need to state that. Okay. So if you wanted to keep the arrow per pale, it would need to be specified on a bend, an arrow per pale, and so on. So I give you an example of two arrows on a chevron. Okay, and this is not actually out of any specific piece of heraldry. I was just throwing that together as an example. The idea being that they're still point down, but because they're on a chevron, they follow the line of the chevron. Okay. And I also give you this example. This is actually the SCA arms of Siegfried von Höflichkeit, a Duke of the West. And the mullet is elongated to base. If this was not placed on the bend, it would be vertical. Okay, the longer arms of the compass star, or the star here, would be vertical. Because it's on the bend, it follows the line of the bend. Okay, but you don't have to place that in the blazon. Okay, and you'll notice it doesn't say anything about the mullet being bendwise. Okay, and the third example is for somebody who decided they wanted to have their musical notes vertical on a chevron. Okay, and so in order to do that, they had to actually define it as 3 quavers, which is the musical note, palewise argent. That informs anybody looking at this that they are vertical rather than following the line. If they were not defined as pale-wise, then two of them would be at an angle, and the one in the middle would probably be as you see it, okay? Which would probably be a little strange, but there you go. Okay, so let's see here. And again, College of Arms glossary, there's a default argument or arrangement section. So I just wanted to make sure that you have all this information if you really need it. So when we talk about placing multiple charges on a field, so there are default positions where you place the individual charges, and that's what I'm showing you here. So if you state that there are 3 cocks, which is what we're seeing here for cock field, they default to 2 and 1. So 2 in top and 1 in the bottom. Okay. So, and again, the College of Arms has a glossary on arrangement. So we see this, these are the default, but also notice that the arms underneath that, the Arms of England, are not using the default position of the lions in this case. They're using them in pale. Okay, that places them in the position of a pale, one above the other. Notice that they are different sizes. Again, this is the space filling aspect that I keep bringing up, is the one in the bottom is smaller because that's the only amount of room that's there. Okay, the one in the middle is just a little bit smaller than the one at the top because there's more room at the top. And so the idea is that you're filling the space as best you can. Okay, so I give you some more examples down here. Let's see, the Arms of St. George, nice and simple, a plain cross. Next to it, the city of York has 5 lions placed on a cross. And because there's 5 of them, this is where they would show up. If the one in the middle, if you only had 4, there wouldn't be one in the middle. It's really, you're just placing them in the places that make the most sense for symmetry. Again, we fall into that whole symmetry thing. Okay. Now, I do want to point out, if the cross were not there, the lions would have to be defined as being in cross. Okay, that would define them as being in that same set of, as they're shown here. Okay. Now, the next arms over, during the Sea of Durham, has a cross with 4 lions on the field. They're not on the cross, so the cross isn't as big. Way back when we were talking about ordinaries, we talked about the fact that if you're placing charges on an ordinary, then the ordinary will be bigger. If you're placing charges around it, the ordinary will be smaller. This is what we're looking at here. Okay. In order to fit those 4 lions in, the cross isn't as big as the one for the city of York. Okay. But the idea here again is there's no place else for those lions to be. Okay. And we're going to talk about forced positions in a moment here. But the idea is that if you define this under the, let's see, this is azure, a cross between 4 lions argent. The cross is argent, so the lions can't be on the cross because you can't place argent on top of argent. So they must be on the field. And because they're on the field, they must fit into those 4 quadrants around the cross because that's where they would logically go. So the blazon doesn't have to define all of that. Okay. Now, the last one shows you a bend between 6 crosslets Ficci argent. And that's an interesting one because notice the position of the crosses in the top half of the shield versus the ones in the bottom half of the shield. Again, we're filling the space. Now, if the person wanted to have the crosses following the line of the bend, they would have to call them as being bendwise or in bend. Actually, bendwise would be the wrong term, it would be in bend. And that would force them to follow the line, just like they are in the bottom half of the shield. The ones in the top would also follow that same. Okay. So I just wanted to put that in as well. And that's, again, that's in my notes. So. Okay, so let's see here. Now, specific layout, again, I'm using the Arms of England again because it's nice and easy. The default position for 3 lions would be 2 and 1. But because they're defined as being in pale, this is what you get. You can put them in bend, you can put them in fess, the direction that any field can be parted or divided by some line. Okay. 2 items in saltire is quite common. And I'm showing you the badge of the marshal because that's just the easy one, sable, 2 swords in saltire. However, if we did not use in saltire here, the 2 swords would actually be vertical. Okay, they would be vertical and side by side. So that's kind of an important point here. These would be pale-wise, and they would be side by side or in fess. Um, so, okay. So there are some specific terms for posture, for placement, and so on. And I wanted to bring these up because, again, there's a lot of stuff. And again, don't try to memorize. There's a lot here. Okay, so I'm giving you an example of an arrow bendwise. So this is in the same direction of a bend, but there's no bend on the field. There's no line of division that's a bend. There's no anything else. It's just an arrow bendwise on whatever the field happens to be. Okay, you can do palewise, fesswise, crosswise. If you have, crosswise would have to be something that you could do that with. But the idea is that you can follow the various lines. Okay. Um, and then in bend, I'm showing 3 arrows in bend. Okay. So what this is the arrows are in the direction of a bend as far as just their placement on the field, but by default they're in pale, or they're pale-wise, I'm sorry, they're vertical. This is where it gets a little confusing, the difference between pale-wise versus in-pale. They're pale-wise because they're vertical, but that's the default posture for an arrow, so you don't have to define it. Okay, so anyway, so again, you can use in-pale, in-fess, and so on. So you can lay charges out in a variety of ways just by using in whatever position, or pale-wise, or again, pale-wise, bend-wise, bend-wise, sinister, and so on. You can also place charges, and I didn't put any examples in, but at the top of the field, centered would be in chief, in base would be at the bottom of the field, centered, in dexter chief would be the top left, sinister chief would be the top right, and so on. Okay, if you really needed to do that. Okay, and I didn't pull an example of this, but the arms of Verena Laurelin, she has a Tau cross in dexter chief, I believe. So that's pretty much her whole arms. So anyway, you can also have a charge issuant. It can be coming from the side or from another charge. That can be interesting. One of the examples that I saw but I didn't grab is a fess, which is a bar across the field, just horizontal across the field, and then issuing out of the top of it is a demi-lion. It's a half lion. So it's issuing from the fess, which is kind of an interesting way to place your charges. Okay. So again, lots of different things that you can do with all of this. Now, multiple charges and forced positions. What I mean by this is if you're reading a blazon, sometimes they don't tell you where the individual charges are. So they may do something like quarterly, gules in argent, 2 mullets, argent. And that's it. They don't tell you where the mullets go. Well, because of the fact that the mullets, and this is the example, the mullets or the stars are argent, they can't go on the argent field. And because part of the field is argent, you can't place them partially on the argent field. So the only place they can go is on the 2 red quadrants of the quarterly field. Okay, and so this is called a forced position. There's no other place they can go. Okay. Now, if you're using the same field, so you wanted the quarterly field, but you wanted the 2 stars in the first quadrant or the first quarter, you would have to define that. And quarterly gules in argent in the first, 2 mullets in fess, should be actually state argent as well, but I left that out by accident. But anyway, we'll actually place them in this position as shown. So they're only in the first quarter of the quarterly field. So it is possible to do that. We fall into the asymmetrical device that way, but it is a way to do it. Okay. There's a lot more. I'm just trying to make you aware of some of the possibilities. I do want to point out, and this is in the last bullet point at the bottom here, heralds prefer a simple blazon where possible. We try to avoid using extra words, but there are times when you need the extra words. You just have to have them, otherwise the arms will not be something that a scribe will be able to reproduce based off of the blazon, or somebody else just trying to draw it up won't be able to reproduce. And the whole point of blazon, the heraldic language, is to make it something that we can reproduce. So If we have to use more words, we will. Okay, now, when you have a charge holding a charge, so a lion holding a sword or whatever, that charge can either be maintained or it can be sustained, and there's a difference between them. Okay, so a maintained charge is something that's a little smaller, and a sustained charge is something that tends to be closer to the size or the equal weight, if you want to look at it that way, as the other charge. So if you have a lion holding a sword and the sword is really big, then that would be a sustained. The lion would be sustaining a sword, where if otherwise it would be maintaining a sword. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So anyway, in Cena, they give a couple of examples in the rules. Ghoul's a lion maintaining an open book argent. Basically, the book is generally going to be fairly small. If it was sustaining it, that would be a really large book. Okay, so yeah, and to add to this, you have some charges that often default to maintaining a charge, but they're not placed in the blazon. So a squirrel stand erect maintaining a nut, you don't normally have to define the maintaining a nut, okay, or between his forepaws even. You could just simply state a squirrel stand erect, and by default, a squirrel might actually have a nut between his paws. Okay. Now, again, some people insist on using that, you putting that into the blazon, and some people don't. So, yeah, my examples here: SCA Arms of Asa, Thorvald's daughter, and if you don't know Asa, you should. She's a wonderful person. But anyway, notice that this is her preferred version of her arms, and notice that the otter there has a fish in its mouth. This is maintaining. Okay. However, it's not in the blazon because, again, an otter defaults into some heraldic artists to having a fish in its mouth. It is perfectly logical or perfectly okay to draw it without the fish in its mouth. I'm sure that Asa, if she was getting a scroll, wouldn't complain. But if you know that she likes having the fish in the mouth, then you would want to put the fish in the mouth. Now, it is possible she really wanted it to be there. If it was something that was really important to her, she could actually insist on the blazon stating an otter statement maintaining a fish in its mouth, and that would have made sure that anybody reading it would always put the fish in. So, but this is one of those cases of, artistic license, if nothing else. Now, for those of you in Rivenoak or near Rivenoak, you may have seen the badge for the curmudgeon of Rivenoak, which is Argent, a Cali Greyhound, rampant to sinister, sable, maintaining a wooden tankard and a wooden club proper. So it's maintaining two separate charges, one in each of its forearms. Okay, I just threw that one in because I thought it was kind of fun. But anyway, now I also want to show you the difference between maintained and sustained. So Sabrina de la Bear has a rose that is sustained by the bear. Notice the size of the rose compared to the size of the bear. Look at the one above it and notice the size of the charges that are being maintained there. They're smaller. Okay. In this case, the rose, if not an equal weight, is very close to equal weight to that of the bear as far as visual size. Okay. And so this would be a sustained rose rather than a maintained rose. Now, if you get it wrong, don't sweat it. The heralds will deal with it. It's not a big deal. I'm just throwing it out there to give you ideas and, again, examples. So, okay. Now, domitiation. We don't really do much with this. You don't see it come up very often. This is the one that you see the most when people talk about domitiation because it's in Fox Davies. The idea here is that you can take half of one charge and half of another charge and cram them together. And in this case, we have a lion passant garden domitiated with the hulk of a ship. Kind of an interesting charge, and it really becomes a single charge because of the fact that they're touching each other. They're conjoined basically at that point. So it's half of a ship and half of a lion. It tends to be treated as a single charge, and you can get some very interesting results. Now, this last bit here on the domitiation, because we were talking, I was working up stuff on domitiation. This song immediately popped into my head. It's called The Herald's Complaint, written by a herald of many years standing in the SCA, Baldwin of Erebor. The College of Arms, after he wrote the song, registered this badge to him because it's the chorus of his song. And the chorus is actually shown on here. But the idea is that these cockatrices are delineated with the trees. Okay. And so it's kind of an odd one. And a dove displayed upon a billet, checky or in gules. The billet is the rectangle. Okay. Between a pair of cockatrices clad in motley like a fool's. So motley is fool's clothing, right? Their feathers were diminuted with a tree eradicated. So the tree is, you're seeing the roots of the tree, limbed and fruited counter company. And the counter company didn't really come across on this because I didn't understand the term at the time when I did that. But anyway, it's really kind of fun. And if you really want to see all the details, you can go out to the West Kingdom History website, look at the Bardic stuff, look under Baldwin of Erebor, you'll find the Herald's Complaint. And I added, along with the sheet music from the Ontir songbook, I added the description from the College of Arms of why they did what they did. It's very funny. So anyway, and I put the full blazon in of how that's registered and so on. But anyway, and it very much follows the chorus. So, and they surprised him. They blindsided him with it. So anyway, so now one thing that comes up a lot with heralds, and unfortunately there's a bad rumor running around out there, is that the idea that the West Kingdom College of Heralds does not register non-European armory. And the problem is we actually do, it just doesn't come up all that often. Okay. The place that it comes up the most is with Japanese armory. So, but I do want to point out, heraldry in the SCA uses the European style blazoned because if another culture had something resembling a College of Heralds, which many of them don't, it would be very hard to try to incorporate those into the way the rules and the European style blazon works. So the big thing is you can create a Mon by using charges from Japanese heraldry, okay, which is Mon or Japanese heraldry. I don't even know if Japan had what we would call a College of Arms. I don't know enough of the history of Japan and specifically about heraldry in Japan to really tell you. Where within European heraldry, over time, we started getting registrations where you get books like Papworth, which is everything that was registered in the British Isles, plus some stuff from European heraldry, and so on. And it's huge. It's a monster. But I don't know that Japan did that. I honestly I couldn't tell you. But the idea is that you can do it. Okay. Now, the important thing is that it must be blazonable using European-style blazon terminology. And that's where the tricky part comes in. And when we were looking at some of the inanimate charges, I showed you a Japanese torii gate. We know what a Japanese torii gate tends to look like, so you can call it a Japanese torii gate. I also showed you a Japanese well frame, which can be defined in European blazonry as 4 slats interlinked. And 4 slats being 4 pieces of wood interlinked. And so that can be done. But we can also take a specific flower if you can show that it was used in Japanese heraldry up to 1600. And we can use that in heraldry as long as we can define it. Okay. And so that's where the tricky part comes in. But we are not out to tell people you cannot register this kind of thing. So if you're trying to create something authentic to a specific culture, it's best to work with the heralds or somebody who's familiar with that culture. And there are SCA-wide resources available. So if somebody in the West Kingdom can't help you and you're a West Kingdom herald or you're a West Kingdom resident, you can go find somebody else. The important part is you can do non-European heraldry. Okay. I did want to point out a couple of things. When we're talking about the European heraldry, we also have, say, Vikings, which are a big deal in SCA. Vikings didn't have a College of Arms. Okay, as a matter of fact, Vikings tended to just use decorative motifs on their shields that were very specific to that particular individual. But they weren't really what we would call heraldry. So there are people who have Viking personas who have registered arms so they can get, say, a word scrolls that may not be something that was done by a Viking in period, but they can use charges. There are a lot of ravens used in Viking heraldry and the SCA, that kind of thing. And you can use drakars and all kinds of stuff that refer to Viking heraldry or Viking culture. Um, I did want to also point out that we had someone in 2021, just a few years ago, who wanted to have a South American persona, and they did a lot of research to come up with a crocodile artistic motif that they wanted to use on their arms. They were the ones defining that particular item, and so they had to go through a few hoops to make it something that was registerable. But now we have a defined version of a South American style crocodile head that could be used by somebody else if that's what they wanted to do. Okay, so we are willing to work with people. So I want to make sure to squash the rumor that the heralds don't want to do anything that is not European. Okay, so if you hear that rumor, you have heard it from at least one senior herald right here. That's not the truth. We do want to work with people. We do want to try to help people get armory that they want, that works for them, that works with their culture. So I just want to make sure that's out there. Okay, enough of that. So now, a few more things that you have to be aware of is that I've been mentioning all along that we try to go for simple armory. We encourage really simple if possible. It's not always possible, but we encourage it. But there is a complexity count, and this is an actual rule. If you have a coat of arms that somebody sits down and starts counting up charges and starts counting up colors on a device, and it reaches 9, it is too complex. More than 8 is too complex. Okay. There are some interesting specifics. A fur, while it is typically 2 tinctures, so ermine was white with black ermine spots, it counts as a single one for the purpose of this count. Okay. So ermine would be 1, and then whatever charge on top of that, and so on. All charges, including maintained or sustained, can count as an item, and each tincture is counted, including proper. Proper gets fun because, for example, a fox is red, black, and white. That's 3 tinctures. Okay, so the fun stuff. Okay. Anyway, multiple charges of the same type count as 1 charge. So if you were looking at my device, I have 2 stag's heads. It would count as 1 because they're just one of them is reversed to the other, but it's 2 stag's heads. It's just 1 stag. It would be 1 charge. Okay. So anyway, and then there are 2 tinctures that would give it a total of 3. So anyway, that's an interesting point. You're not expected to, again, memorize all of this, so don't sweat it. I have to go back and look at what is counted for the complexity count every once in a while because it throws me off. It's also possible to have arms that are too simple. Okay, now that seems like kind of a contradiction to the idea that we want you to have simple arms, but we're talking super simple. So a device that is a simple tincture, you cannot register sable. Okay, that would be a black field with nothing on it. You can't register that. Okay, they must have a divided field or a plain field with at least 1 charge. Okay, so you can go from there. Now, it is possible to get a field-only device. There's somebody who is no longer in the West, but some years ago registered per chevron, vert, and sable, or sable and vert, one or the other. But it's just those 2 colors, and it's a per chevron field. That's the whole thing. There's no charges on top of it. So it is possible, but it's rare. Okay. You cannot have designs that only include letters, abstract symbols, and astrological signs. And this is because that would mean that you would be keeping somebody else from being able to use their own initials, their name, their motto, things like that. So, okay. Now, when you're drawing creatures, I wanted to show you this because it's actually a really useful thing. When we were looking at birds, I used some of Eowyn's images. So I'm going to bring this up, and I'm going to go to the end of the article real quick, and then scroll back up. Okay. So basically, she gives you a really nice guide in here for just drawing the positions. Okay, she gives you rampant in 2 different versions. The first one is more vertical than the second one, but they're both rampant. And she gives you the idea that this is the kind of the basic outline of where the limbs go. This is a little more detailed, adding the head, and this is kind of a semi-finished version. Although, of course, obviously, if you were going to draw it for your arms, you'd want a little more detail. But the idea is to give you a guideline for drawing these different positions. So this is a really useful thing, and it was aimed at scribes, but it's useful just for everybody in general. So if you just kind of go down, there's Sayant, Sayant erect, that gives you the difference there. Couchant, dormant, the head positions, or the head cooped, a head erased. You saw some of the bird stuff, not all of it, but you saw some of it. The positions of the wings, stuff with fish, and combatant, adorst, and all kinds. So there's just some useful stuff in here for just generally for drawing your animals. So I wanted to point this out to you, make you aware that it's there as a guideline. If you're not familiar with a specific posture and you want to get a feel for drawing it, this is a handy place to jump to. So, and again, the link is here on the slide, and it's going to be, I've referenced it all the way through most of the lessons. So, okay. So if you're not an artist but want to use a creature in your arms, you may want to find someone you know who can draw. I'm lucky. I married a really good artist, so I don't have to worry about it too much. But not everybody can get away with that. So but we all know people who are artists, and the scribes that are really good and helpful, and there are heralds who are really good at drawing. So you just never know. So a few more things on rules that you really kind of need to know about is, and I'm not going to give you a list here, but I'm going to give you links to lists. There are restricted charges, there's reserved regalia, and there's reserved charges. So what this comes down to is restricted charges cannot be used, period. This is either because of offense, and so the most common example of that is a filfot, or as it's known in the modern world, the swastika. Okay, it was co-opted by some really bad people, and it has horrible connotations, and we do not allow the use of it in the SCA heraldry, and we don't allow the use of anything close to it. Okay, sometimes it's due to having a very specific meaning in real-world heraldry, and the example that comes up the most for this is the imperial dragon, which is the Chinese five-toed East Asian dragon, which was only used by the Emperor of China. So that would be very presumptuous of you to try to use that. Okay. Reserved regalia is stuff that's reserved for specific, peerages or royal peers or whatever. The simple example is a cap of maintenance, gules, trimmed ermine. We looked at that briefly in a previous lesson. That's reserved to the members of the Order of the Pelican. However, any other color of cap of maintenance can be worn, including having an ermine fur, but it cannot be red with an ermine fur. Okay. But that also includes an aural of chain, of simple plain chain, and all kinds of fun stuff, a white belt, all of those things. And reserve charges are ones that are reserved for specific use under specific situations, a charge canton for an augmentation of arms, as we've mentioned before, and all of that good stuff. And in the notes for this, I have links for restricted charges, reserved regalia, and reserve charges. So if you want to go look at what the lists look like, they're all in the glossary for the College of Arms. Okay, and again, I have the links available. Okay, so now that we've gone through all of that, let's talk about designing armory, because that's kind of the ultimate goal here. So I wanted to get all of that stuff out of the way, partially because there's some cool things that you can do and also some things that you can't do. So I wanted to cover those before we get here. Now, there are some questions that you should answer, or if you're a herald trying to work with somebody, that they should answer before starting. So, is this going to be a device or badge? Okay, that's pretty straightforward. What are your favorite colors? What colors do you look good in? Sometimes they're not the same thing. Okay, some people really like a specific set of colors, but they don't look all that good in them because their own personal skin colors don't work with those colors or whatever. How well can you draw? Okay, if you're not a great artist, straight lines sometimes may be the way to go, or templates, things with circles. However, I do want to point out, this doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't register something you cannot draw easily. Okay? I don't want to discourage you from using something because you're not a great artist. I'm not a great artist. I have stag's heads. They're fairly complicated. Okay? Luckily, again, I married a good artist. But but the point being that, if it's something where, you're more comfortable doing it yourself and not having somebody else do it, and you're not a great artist, straight line is great, templates, things like that. But we don't want to discourage you from doing something else. Are there very specific field divisions or field treatments that you really like? And again, you'd have to go back to some of the early lessons, but there's a lot of great stuff out there, and it's figuring out how you want to combine everything. Okay, so are there specific creatures or charges that you want on your device? You can get away with really simple arms. You can get away with having different types of charges and different types of creatures. There's a lot that can be done. So just let your imagination run wild, but be willing to deal with the fact that you may not be able to get exactly what you want. Now, do these specific creatures or charges have a special meaning to you? Does a 7-pointed star mean something very specific to you for something that happened in your past? Whatever, that kind of thing. So, are you prepared to modify something if it will make the armory registerable? This would be a case of sitting down and playing with it and working with somebody. But these are all important questions. Okay, just things you should think about as you're kind of trying to lay out your ideas for what you want to do. Now, when you're dealing with the field, a device must have a field. If it's a badge, it can have a field. Again, we talked about fieldless earlier. Um, so I just wanted to make sure I covered that again. If you are using a field, what tincture or tinctures do you want to use? Are you going to divide the field? If so, do you have a specific field division that you like? If you really like Gyrony, which is divided into 8 parts, okay, you can do that. What tinctures do you want to use? Are you using a line of partition, one of the fancier lines? I don't really recommend taking a Gyrony and making it Rayony as well, because that's just bizarre. Okay, it gets really weird. So anyway, other things, your charges. Charges, of course, are what make the things really unique, unless you do come up with that rare field-only device. What charges do you want to use? Single charge, multiple charges, ordinaries, subordinaries, all the things we've been looking at. If you have a specific item that you really like, okay, there's bound to be a way to work it in somehow. Always keep in mind the rule of tincture. And again, I don't really need to spend too much time on that because we've talked about it a lot. Are you going to have more than one of any single charge? Do you need to have 2 swords rather than a single sword? That kind of thing. And again, it may have a specific meaning to you. I'm not making any judgment calls here. I'm just throwing out things. Okay. Keep in mind the whole bit about layers. The first layer is the field. The second layer is on the field. The third layer is on top of other charges. And you can't have a 4th layer. Okay. Fieldless badges, if you wanted to do a badge as well, you do have to, you do want to have a device at some point. But if you wanted to have a badge for a household or whatever, or just because you wanted to have a specific badge that you wanted to use, the charges must be combined into a single charge, as I talked about. And the big thing here, and this is one of the most important things about designing your heraldry, is try things. Start laying things out on paper. It can be large, it can be small, whatever works for you, but lay it out, color it. Make sure that you have the colors in your mind. If you wanted to have blue and white and you needed to have only blue and white charges or blue and white for your device, it can be done. But you need to figure out how you want to do it, and playing with it and laying out variations is a good idea. Try things, move things around, change some of the tinctures if that helps. There's a lot of different things. It's rare, but once in a while, the first item you come up with is the one that you love. Okay. What happens if you can't get it? Okay, it's always possible. Now you'd be surprised at what you can get away with sometimes. Sometimes something that looks like you couldn't possibly register it is something that just flies right through the College of Arms because it's simple, but nobody did it before, or nobody did that combination before. And you would be surprised at what sometimes gets registered. So sometimes by experimenting, you can find something you like better than your first idea. You don't know until you try playing with it. Okay. So one important thing is don't rush. Okay, you got in a word of arms and the Crown said that we want you to register arms. Well, you don't have to do it the next day. Okay, play with it, spend some time, find that thing that works for you. Um, okay, draw each idea that you come up with and color it. Okay, put it on the fridge, put it in the bathroom, someplace you're going to see it all the time. If you have multiple items up on the fridge, and as you're walking around in the kitchen doing stuff, you may suddenly look at one of them and go, nah, and rip it off the fridge. Okay, well, then you just eliminated one possibility and you narrowed down your options. Um, this kind of thing works for some people. It doesn't work for everybody, but yeah, you never know. I'm just, again, throwing ideas out here for ways to deal with it. But the most important thing is don't rush into it. You don't have to. I mean, unless you do find that one item that you absolutely love and you just know this is what you want for your arms. Okay. At that point, okay, go ahead and rush it. We'll deal. So now, I always recommend trying to work with the heralds because we've had a lot of cases lately where the person doesn't want to work with the heralds except that they send in as a submission, and then we have to send it back to them, and we give them suggestions, and then they do something else that has nothing to do with any of the suggestions we gave them, and it comes back, and we have to send it back because again, it's not legal or it had some issue or whatever. If you work with a herald, you can bypass a whole lot of that back and forth stuff. Okay, so your local herald may be good with armory. Some are better than others. One of the most important things to note here is that heralds have a lot of different things that they do. And I'm not going to try to get into all of that, but there's the voice heraldry and there's, and so on. And some heralds are really good at one thing, but they're not good at another. And that's pretty common, really. Some people really love doing the voice heraldry, but they're really not interested in doing armory. Okay, and that's okay. We love all of our heralds. Okay, so but so the big thing is that your local branch herald may not be very good with armory, and so you may need to reach out to somebody else. Okay, so it's a good idea to work with somebody who knows armory fairly well. All right. Now, when you get around to submitting it, or thinking that you're ready to submit it, we have a web page with all the details, and it's provided in just a moment here. It is important to note if you're from another kingdom that the forms are slightly different from kingdom to kingdom. They're little minor things, but including which kingdom they're from. But anyway, this is where our submission guidelines are, and this has a link to all the forms. It has details on how you submit everything, how much it costs, where to send things to, all of that good stuff. And there's links to parts on the Herald's website on where to find information on armory and all of that. So try to give you a lot of details on that page. And we make announcements when the next meetings will be. The next one is the Sunday after Mist Investiture, so that's a couple of weeks away. So anyway, so where to get help? So the SCA has a lot of resources. I'm just trying to give you lots of options here. Your local branch herald, again, may be familiar with heraldry, may not be, or with armory, they may not be. In the West, we have a consultation table that shows up at most kingdom events, and sometimes at other events if they're requested. And we have, of course, an arms research page on the Herald's website. And you can use the Facebook page for the heralds for the West Kingdom, and you'll be surprised. If you post something there, you get responses fairly quickly. So we have a set of articles. The SCA College of Arms has a set of articles, and again, so I'm putting a ton of links out here on armory, and some of that breaks down into specific regional armory things and so on. The internet in general, but again, as I pointed out several times through some of the lessons, just because it's on a website or because it's in a book, a specific depiction may not be allowed for whatever reason. Okay, so be careful. If you're not sure, check with somebody. And I just put a footnote. If you don't live in the West Kingdom, check with your kingdom's College of Heralds. So there you go. Now I'm going to briefly talk about this. I'm not going to go into the rules. Okay, conflict research. One of the most important aspects of heraldry within the SCA is that once it's registered, it's yours. It is protected. That means that somebody else who has a similar coat of arms cannot be too close to yours, otherwise it might be confused with yours. Okay? And so we end up having what is called conflict research, and that's what a good portion of our Herald's meetings is we sit down with all of the submissions and we do the conflict research, and we look to see if there's a conflict, somebody who has a coat of arms already registered that's too close to what you want to register. We hope not, but sometimes they do come up. Okay. If you want to register something, work with a Herald, let us do the conflict research. You don't need to know how to do it. I mean, if you're interested in learning how, we welcome you, but it takes some training, and that's beyond the purpose of this class. We're not going to go into it in any details. There are articles in the West Kingdom Herald's handbook, but the easiest thing, if you really want to learn more about the rules, is just to go out and read them. One of the nice things is the current set of rules has a lot of examples. So it talks about a specific rule, then it gives you some examples of what it's talking about. So if you really want to know, you can learn it, and we encourage it if you're interested, but a lot of people don't want to go there, and that's okay. Okay. So I just wanted to make sure you don't have to know the rules. So once it's registered, what do? You will hear about the fact that it's registered. Okay. But there are a couple of things I want to point out. Once it's registered, your armory, your SCA name, your armory includes your device, any badges you register, and so on. They're registered to you in perpetuity, or at least as long as the SCA exists. Okay, and we're still going strong, so it doesn't look like we're going away anytime soon. Now, this includes if you die. Okay, so what that means is you die, your arms are still protected. They're under your name. They're registered to you. Okay, so it is possible to create what is called a heraldic will, which would be saved with your files, and you can provide instructions, which means when you die, release my name, my device, my badge, or you can will them to somebody. You can state, my best friend over here really likes this device, and I'm willing it to them. And if they accept it, then it's theirs. Okay, so we can help you do a heraldic will if that's what you want to do. Not very many people do, but it is something that it's an option. Okay. Anyway, from here it's yours. You can use it on banners. You can put it on shields if you fight, or even if you don't fight. You can put it on clothing, but the important thing is use it. Once you've registered it, that's why you wanted it in the first place. Use it. Put it on your banners. And again, how you use it, well, again, that's at least one more class beyond the scope of this class. There are specific types of banners, and there's all kinds of other stuff that you can do. Badges can be used to mark your belongings. If you have a household badge, you might want a banner that you gather your household under, and so on. So again, there's a lot of different things that you can do. You can put together, actual, embroidered badges that show your household affiliations or favors or whatever. But the idea is that's what heraldry is about. Heraldry is the pageantry of the SCA. Okay, this is where a lot of the pageantry comes in. When you see at a coronation like this coming weekend, you will most likely see their Royal Highnesses come in with these fantastic banners floating in the air with people carrying them in for them and all kinds of fun stuff. And that's just one of the cool things that we do in the SCA. So just a couple of other things. Somewhere down the road, you may decide that you want to change your arms. It could be because your whole set of interests change. It could be because I know one person who changed their persona because their whole style of clothing changed. At one point, they were doing Middle Eastern, and so they had very Middle Eastern clothing. They had a Middle Eastern name. They had arms that were kind of Middle Eastern, and then they went German. And they changed everything. They went all Landsknecht, and their arms changed, their name changed, the whole bit. So sometimes people do that. There's a lot of different reasons. Maybe you have a bad association because of a failed relationship, and you don't want to have those arms anymore. Whatever. There's no judgment call here. It's whatever reason you want to change your arms. You must decide if you do that, if you want to keep the old arms. At that point, it becomes a badge assigned to you. Or if you want to just release them, and that puts them out to the wild. Somebody else could register those same arms if they wanted to. It's up to you. Okay. You can simply release them if you're not using them. If you, at the very beginning of your time in the SCA, decided this stuff is so cool, I want 4 badges, and I want this, and you suddenly decide, 10 years down the line that you're not using some of your badges, you can just release them. Okay. If you're not using them, release them. Let somebody else have them. Okay. So just things that you can do. I'm just throwing these out. So again, lots of ideas and so on. So that is the whole lesson. Now I'm curious. That's actually a little shorter than the last one. I'm surprised. Okay. Anyway, so are there any questions? And at this point, if you have questions, you can probably put your mic up because I'm not seeing that toolbar. It's covered by the recording thing. So if you have any questions, go ahead and turn your mic on and go ahead and ask. I know I covered a huge amount of ground. Everybody okay? Everybody still awake? All good? Well, okay. Well, that's pretty much it. I provided you with a huge amount of terminology. I've given you, oops, there's that toolbar. Can I see it? Oh, there's something. Okay. Permission to conflict. Okay. So there is the possibility, if you have a coat of arms that um, that you're real happy with, but somebody else out there may want to conflict with your device. We have very specific rules on how far different arms have to be or a device has to be from another device or badge or whatever. But you can give permission if it's one significant difference from your armory. And that says you have permission to conflict. And you can also create what is called a blanket permission, which means anybody out there in the world who has arms that are very close to yours can register them as long as they have one significant difference from your arms. Again, I'm not going to try to define significant difference here, but that could be simply the tincture of a charge on the device, that kind of thing. So I hope that at least helps. So let's see. So anyway, so I've given you a ton of stuff. Let's see, what was the next item here? Yes. All of the slides and everything are going to be online. I'll be putting those up soon, and then Sarah will get the video to the Kingdom IT department. However, keep in mind, we have a major SCA event this weekend, so I wouldn't expect necessarily that the video will be up until after Beltane, although you never know. So let's see here. The videos will be available, and go forth and make heraldry. So that's the whole point of everything that's here. Working, whether you're a herald who wants to work with people and be better at doing it, or if you want to learn more about heraldry and start working on your arms, whatever it happens to be, have fun with it. And always remember, there's people that you can ask questions of. We're everywhere, and we'll probably give you more information than you wanted. So, okay, so I've noticed that the resources used slide here, it's the last slide of the notes, is everything from all of the lessons. Okay, I put everything in here, and I also added a couple of items, or actually I added one item. No, I actually did. I added two items in here. One of them is Bruce Draconarius' A Grammar of Blazonry. So if you're interested in learning how blazon works in more detail, that's an interesting thing to know about. This actually, he breaks it down fairly well, starting with the field, starting with the upper left corner, and this is how you define the words that are used in the blazon. And then I added Cormac Moore's Poorhouse, which is the fourth item on the slide. He has a bunch of lessons on heraldic design as well, and he's been working on doing some videos which are more involved. He's a better artist than I am, and he's been doing some animations and all kinds of stuff. So anyways, just another resource for you if you want. And these are the books and some of the websites and so on that I've used for these various lessons. So there's all of that. So I'm going to stop recording if I can figure out where it's at. This stupid